Okay, I'm going to take you through a brief introduction to mental health. We're going to cover some basic definitions, talk about some of the language and concepts that are important to consider, and then talk about one theoretical perspective on how we can think about mental health as it relates to subjective well-being. So first, what is mental health? Mental health is something that's rather common to hear about and talk about now. However, we don't always associate it with maybe the most refined language or terms that we could. So often when we hear mental health, we actually think about mental health issues or disorders in kind of a negative way, rather than thinking about what it means to be in good mental health. So, the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So, as we see there are many kind of social, psychological, and emotional aspects of mental health. So, it is a rather broad and complex term with many different dimensions that we can talk about. But like most definitions, that isn't necessarily the only or the best definition that we can have. So scholars have argued that we need to think of mental health as more of a dynamic state. We need to acknowledge that there are ups and downs and that we will move in and out of these positive emotions and feelings and relationships. And that's all part of a normal progression and normal fluctuations in our health and well-being. So to kind of illustrate some of this, I want to talk about a couple other terms that are commonly associated with mental health and quite commonly used in different contexts, and talk about how we can think of them as more dynamic terms as opposed to only negative terms or threats to mental health. So first, we have stress. Stress is something that's quite commonly heard or used. You know, we've all felt stressed at one time or another. We've all heard someone complain about stress or express that they are stressed. But what does stress really mean? Stress is our body's response to a situational pressure or demand. So this means that stress is a reaction that our body has to a variety of different conditions. And these can be from both micro level or macro level influences. So, micro individual things that only affect our individual body, or broader influences like issues in our environment. So, we can feel stressed because we have too many tasks to do or complete at one time. Maybe we have too many people we are trying to work with and manage to get to do something. But we can also feel stressed because of our environment. So perhaps the weather is too hot and you're feeling stressed. Your body's having a stress response to that environment. Or perhaps you don't feel safe in the environment that you're in, and so you are stressed due to that environment. So stress is a normal response to our body, and we can have normal experiences of stress. However, stress can be accompanied by a perception or a feeling that we're not able to deal with this stress. So if we get stressed about upcoming assignments, but we're able to progress through that and get done, that is a normal feeling of stress. But when we feel like we aren't able to overcome those stressors, or that we have the insufficient resources or capacity to do it, that is when stress may become an issue. Similarly, we have anxiety. And anxiety is another one of those words that gets thrown around a lot by different people at different times. So, at its basic, most simplest definition, anxiety is feelings of worry or nervousness. And again, this is something that is part of a normal fluctuation in our well-being. At low levels, anxiety can actually be really stimulating and productive. So think about the anxiety that you feel in the lead up to a test or an assessment. That anxiety about the impending deadline and the work that you have to do allows you to focus your energies and get that work done when you need to. Similarly, the anxiety that you might feel before running a big race or competing in a big competition. That anxiety allows you to focus, allows you to get into the zone, and to really think about how you can focus on doing the best that you possibly can in that competition. However, at high levels, anxiety can make you feel helpless, confused, scared, or distressed. So it's important to acknowledge that anxiety doesn't only mean one thing, that in fact it can be a state that we experience and we come in and out of, or it can be a trait, so something that is felt more long term. Now, it is important here to distinguish between that trait of anxiety and another category, which could be called anxiety disorders. So, anxiety disorders are when these feelings of worry or fear exist for no apparent reason. And an individual who's experiencing an anxiety disorder may describe it as helpless or irrational struggle to complete basic tasks because of this fear or worry. So an example of this would be arachnophobia. If you're unable to go walk your dog because you are so afraid of spiders that may be on the sidewalk, and you don't know why you have this irrational feeling and you can't complete that task because of it, that could be referred to as an anxiety disorder. And there's several different anxiety disorders, but as we want to focus on mental health promotion, I'll just leave that as our example. So next up, I want to kind of problematize this relationship a little bit between health, mental health, and well-being, and talk a little bit about the different ways that we can think about it or conceptualize it in a bigger picture. So I'm going to talk about a theory that's called homeostasis theory. So rather than only thinking about mental health from a pathological perspective or from a positive psychology perspective, which we often see, the homeostasis theory fits somewhere in the middle. So where pathology would only look at disorders or illnesses, and positive psychology might only look at the positives or the things that were the assets that we're trying to build and improve on, homeostasis theory lies somewhere in the middle. And this theory is based on the idea that our mental health or subjective well-being is under homeostatic control. So that means that there is a natural order of things that we will go back to and that we will try to regulate to. However, as we move through our lives and our lived experiences, we experience a variety of different stimuluses that push us in different ways and move us away from that homeostasis. And the kind of goal of our subjective well-being is to get back to that regulated normal state. And the reason homeostasis theory is interesting or useful is because when we look at the literature about different activities or different influences and the impacts that they have on subjective well-being, there's a lot of kind of inconsistencies or trouble mapping how these different experiences can have direct influences on our subjective well-being. So rather than thinking about a certain impact or stimulus having a certain output, homeostasis theory refocuses the idea on that center line or that homeostatic state and lets us think about the ways that these different influences can push or pull us away from that homeostasis. The other kind of important thing that homeostasis theory lets us think about is the processes that are involved when we're looking at influences on our subjective well-being and mental health. So in order to understand how different things have impacts on our subjective well-being, we need to really understand the processes through which these impacts lead to different outcomes. So homeostasis theory suggests that we need to think a bit more about the ways that activities can be indirectly linked to subjective well-being. So, for example, if we take physical activity, we may think that intuitively physical activity leads to positive or better outcomes with regard to our mental health and subjective well-being. However, when we look at the literature, it's kind of full of gray areas and it's not super easy to draw that direct line. So how much physical activity do people need to engage in? What types of physical activity do people engage in? And then what measures of subjective well-being will this impact or influence? There's many kind of different relationships, and really there's no clear way to draw these lines or correlations. But when we look at this from a process perspective and the different steps that are involved, we can look at the different ways that physical activity might have an impact on our subjective well-being. So perhaps there isn't a direct correlation between physical activity and subjective well-being, but physical activity may take place in group settings with other people, which lets us have more contact, which allows us to feel more connected to our community and our social relationships, which in turn leads to improvements in our subjective well-being or our mental health. So importantly, this theory lets us really problematize that process and think about the different ways that different impacts can lead to different outcomes. So that's a wrap on mental health. I'll link a few other articles in the description here. Be sure to check them out for more details on these concepts that we talked about here.